If you're enjoying this story, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel for more incredible tales from the Old West. Your support means everything to us. The dust swirled across the main street of Copper Ridge like ghostly fingers, clawing at the weathered wooden buildings that stood defiant against the relentless Arizona sun. It was 1873, and the mining town pulsed with the desperate energy of men chasing dreams buried deep in the earth. Margaret O'Sullivan pressed her palm against the cracked window of the makeshift clinic, watching the endless parade of broken souls stumbling through the streets below. Her white apron, once pristine, now bore the stains of countless emergencies that had consumed her life for the past 2 years. The copper mine had been generous with its casualties. Crushed fingers, cave-ins, lung sickness that turned strong men into hollow shells gasping for breath. Margaret had come west from Boston after her husband died in the war, seeking purpose in healing others. But the weight of so much suffering had begun to crush her spirit. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. She turned to see Jake Morrison, the mine foreman, supporting a young Mexican worker whose arm hung at an unnatural angle. Blood seeped through his torn shirt, and his face was pale with shock. "Doc's drunk again," Jake muttered, his weathered face grim. "Miguel here got caught in a cave-in. His arm's busted bad, and I think he's got internal bleeding too." Margaret's hands moved with practiced efficiency, but her heart felt heavy as lead. She guided Miguel to the examination table, her mind already cataloguing the supplies she'd need. The morphine was running low, and she had no idea when the next shipment would arrive. As she worked to set Miguel's arm, the young man's eyes met hers. Despite his pain, she saw something there that made her pause. A strange knowing, as if he could see straight through to her soul. "Senora," he whispered in accented English, "you carry too much weight. The spirits, they tell me you are drowning in sorrow that is not yours to bear." Margaret's hands stilled. She'd heard whispers about Miguel's family, how his grandmother was known throughout the territory as a curandera, a healer who worked with herbs and ancient wisdom, but she'd never paid much attention to such talk. "I'm fine," she replied curtly, continuing to wrap his arm. "Just hold still." But Miguel's words had struck something deep within her. That night, after the clinic had finally fallen silent, Margaret sat alone in her small room above the building. The walls seemed to press in around her, and she could hear the rowdy laughter from the saloon across the street. She thought of all the men she'd lost despite her best efforts. The miners who'd died from lung disease, the gunfighters who'd bled out on her table, the women who'd succumbed to fever during childbirth. Each loss felt like a personal failure. The next morning brought news that shattered what remained of her composure. A messenger arrived with word that the mine's main shaft had collapsed, trapping 17 men underground. The rescue efforts had been going on for hours, but hope was fading fast. Margaret gathered her supplies and rushed to the mine site. The scene was chaos. Wives and children gathered in anxious clusters, their faces streaked with tears and dirt. The rescue crew worked frantically, but the rubble seemed endless. Hour after hour, she treated the injured who were brought up from the depths. Burns from exploded lanterns, crushed limbs, men overcome by poisonous gases. Her hands shook as she worked, and she felt something inside her beginning to crack. When the last body was brought up, Margaret finally understood the full scope of the tragedy. 12 men dead, 5 severely injured. Among the deceased was Miguel's older brother Carlos, who'd been working his first day in the mine to support his newborn child. That night, Margaret sat in her clinic surrounded by the wounded, but she felt utterly empty. The weight of all the death and suffering had finally broken something fundamental within her. She looked at her hands, stained with blood and failure, and felt nothing but despair. Unable to bear it any longer, she walked outside into the cool night air. The stars above seemed cold and distant, offering no comfort. Without really thinking about where she was going, she began walking toward the edge of town. The desert stretched endlessly before her, bathed in silver moonlight. She kept walking, leaving behind the sounds of the dying town. Her feet carried her along a narrow trail that wound between towering saguaro cacti and jagged rock formations. By dawn, she was miles from Copper Ridge, her water nearly gone and her dress torn by thorns. She'd been walking in a daze, driven by some desperate need to escape the crushing weight of her failures. Now, as the sun climbed higher, she realized she was lost. The desert heat was merciless. Margaret stumbled forward, her vision blurring as dehydration took hold. She thought of the men she'd failed to save, the families she'd had to face with news of their loved ones' deaths. Perhaps it was fitting that she should die out here alone. As she collapsed to her knees in the sand, she heard something that made her lift her head. It was a voice, carried on the wind, speaking words in a language she didn't recognize but somehow understood. The voice was gentle, ancient, filled with compassion. She looked up to see a figure approaching through the heat shimmer. An elderly Native American man walked toward her with surprising grace, his weathered face kind but marked by deep wisdom. He wore simple clothes and carried a staff adorned with feathers and small bones. "You are far from home, daughter," he said, his voice carrying that same musical quality she'd heard on the wind. "The spirits whispered to me that a wounded healer would come to the desert seeking death." Margaret tried to speak, but her throat was too dry. The old man knelt beside her and offered her water from a gourd. The liquid was cool and sweet, unlike any water she'd ever tasted. "I am called Windwalker," he continued. "For 60 summers, I have listened to the voices that ride the desert winds. They tell me many things about the living and the dead." As Margaret drank, she felt strength returning to her body. But more than that, she felt something stirring in her soul that she'd thought was lost forever. Hope, perhaps, or simply the will to continue living. "I failed them all," she whispered. "Every person I tried to save, I failed." Windwalker studied her with eyes that seemed to hold the wisdom of countless generations. "The wind tells me you carry the pain of those who have passed, but you have forgotten the joy of those who live because of your hands." He helped her to her feet and guided her to a small cave hidden among the rocks. Inside, she found a cool refuge from the brutal sun. The walls were covered with ancient paintings that seemed to move and dance in the flickering light of Windwalker's fire. "Rest now," he said. "Tomorrow we will begin your true healing." For 3 days, Margaret remained in the cave with Windwalker. He told her stories of the old times, when his people lived in harmony with the land. He spoke of the responsibility that came with the gift of healing, but also of the importance of knowing when to let go. "Death is not your enemy," he explained as they watched the sun set over the desert. "It is simply another part of the Great Circle. Your role is to ease suffering and preserve life when possible, but you cannot hold back the tide forever." Each night, Windwalker would perform ceremonies that seemed to pull the poison of grief from Margaret's soul. He used sage and sweetgrass, chanting in his ancient language, while the wind itself seemed to respond to his call. On the 4th morning, Margaret woke to find Windwalker standing at the cave entrance, listening intently to something only he could hear. His face was troubled. "The voices bring news from your town," he said. "There has been another accident. A fire at the saloon has burned many, and the doctor remains too drunk to help. They search for you, but no one knows where you have gone." Margaret felt her heart clench. Even here, in this place of healing, the suffering of others called to her. But now she understood something she hadn't before. Her gift was not just in her medical knowledge, but in her willingness to stand between others and their pain. "I have to go back," she said quietly. Windwalker nodded as if he'd expected this response. "Yes, but you will not return as the same woman who fled into the desert. The spirits have shown me your path." He reached into a leather pouch and withdrew a small pendant carved from turquoise. It was shaped like a feather, and it seemed to glow with inner light. "This will help you remember what you have learned here," he said, placing it around her neck. When the weight of sorrow becomes too heavy, hold this and listen for the voices on the wind. They will guide you. Windwalker led her back through the desert, following paths that seemed to appear and disappear like mirages. They traveled for hours, but Margaret felt no fatigue. The pendant around her neck seemed to fill her with renewed energy. As they crested a hill, Copper Ridge came into view. Smoke still rose from the ruins of the saloon, and she could see people moving frantically in the streets below. Her heart went out to them, but this time the feeling was different. Instead of the crushing weight of responsibility, she felt a warm compassion that strengthened rather than weakened her. "This is where we part," Windwalker said. "But remember, I am never far away. When the wind blows strong, listen carefully. The voices will always guide those who serve others." Margaret turned to thank him, but he was gone. She stood alone on the hillside, but she no longer felt abandoned. The pendant around her neck pulsed gently, and she could swear she heard whispers in the desert breeze. She walked back into Copper Ridge with purpose in her step. The townspeople rushed to greet her, relief evident on their faces. There were indeed many injured from the fire, and she set to work immediately. But this time was different. As she treated burns and smoke inhalation, she felt a connection to something larger than herself. The pendant seemed to guide her hands, and she found herself knowing exactly what each patient needed. More importantly, when old Pete Wilson died from his injuries, despite her best efforts, Margaret felt sorrow, but not despair. She held his hand as he passed and whispered a prayer that seemed to come from the wind itself. Word of Margaret's return spread quickly through the territory. People spoke of a change in her, a new kind of healing power that went beyond medicine. Some claimed they could see a light around her as she worked, while others swore they heard voices whispering guidance in languages older than memory. Margaret established a new clinic on the outskirts of town, closer to the desert she'd grown to love. She continued her medical practice, but now she also taught others about the importance of listening to the voices that spoke through wind and stone. Years passed, and Margaret became known throughout the territory as the Wind Healer. She never married again, but she found a different kind of fulfillment in her work. The pendant around her neck remained her constant companion, and on quiet nights she could still hear Windwalker's voice, carried on the desert breeze. She often wondered what had become of the old shaman, but somehow she knew he was still out there, listening to the ancient voices and guiding lost souls back to their true path. The desert had taught her that some mysteries were meant to remain unsolved, and that faith was sometimes more powerful than understanding. One winter evening, nearly 20 years after her transformation in the desert, Margaret was tending to a young Apache woman who had been badly beaten by drunken miners. As she cleaned the woman's wounds, she noticed something familiar about her patient's eyes. "You are the one they call Wind Healer," the woman whispered, in perfect English. "My grandfather spoke of you often. He said you were chosen by the spirits to bridge two worlds." Margaret's hands paused in their work. "Your grandfather, Windwalker. He passed to the spirit world 5 winters ago, but before he left, he told me to find you if I ever needed help. He said you would know what to do." The young woman's name was Dancing Moon, and she had been cast out from her tribe for falling in love with a white settler. Now she was caught between two worlds, belonging fully to neither. Over the following months, Margaret took Dancing Moon under her wing, teaching her the healing arts that combined traditional medicine with the spiritual wisdom Windwalker had shared. Together, they created a sanctuary where people of all backgrounds could find healing. Dancing Moon proved to be exceptionally gifted, able to hear the wind voices even more clearly than Margaret. She could sense illness before it manifested, and often knew which herbs would be most effective simply by listening to the desert breeze. As Margaret grew older, she began to understand that her role was not just to heal, but to pass on the ancient knowledge. She trained several apprentices, but Dancing Moon was special. The young woman had inherited her grandfather's gift for communicating with the spirits. One autumn day, as Margaret was teaching Dancing Moon about treating snake bites, they heard shouting from town. A group of Comanche warriors had attacked a wagon train, and there were many wounded survivors. The townspeople were in panic, unsure whether to help or flee. Margaret and Dancing Moon rushed to the scene. The wounded were scattered across the desert floor, both settlers and warriors alike. Without hesitation, Margaret began treating everyone equally, regardless of which side they'd been fighting for. Some of the townspeople protested, but Margaret's reputation was such that they eventually backed down. Dancing Moon worked beside her, her hands glowing with an inner light that seemed to accelerate the healing process. Among the wounded was a young Comanche brave named Running Bear. His injuries were severe, and he was losing consciousness rapidly. As Dancing Moon worked on him, she began to chant in her grandfather's language, and the wind itself seemed to respond. The pendant around Margaret's neck grew warm, and she heard Windwalker's voice as clearly as if he were standing beside her. "The circle continues," he whispered. "The bridge between worlds grows stronger." Running Bear recovered fully, and word of the miracle spread throughout the territory. People began to come from hundreds of miles away, seeking healing not just for their bodies, but for their souls. Margaret established a school for healers, where students learned both conventional medicine and the ancient ways. The curriculum included listening to the wind voices, understanding the spiritual causes of illness, and most importantly, serving all people regardless of their background. The school attracted students from many tribes, as well as settlers from the east. For the first time in the territory's history, people of different cultures worked together in harmony, united by their common desire to heal and serve. Years passed, and Margaret's hair turned silver, while her step grew slower. But her eyes remained bright with the inner fire that Windwalker had rekindled in the desert. She could still hear the voices on the wind, and they brought her news of troubles and triumphs across the vast landscape. One spring morning, Margaret woke to find Dancing Moon standing by her bedside, tears streaming down her face. "The voices told me it's time," she whispered. "Your work here is complete." Margaret smiled and reached for the turquoise pendant around her neck. She'd worn it for so many years that it had become part of her, but now she understood its true purpose. She placed it around Dancing Moon's neck, and immediately the young woman's eyes widened with new understanding. "You are the bridge now," Margaret said softly. "The spirits have chosen you to continue the work. Listen always to the wind voices, and they will guide you to those who need healing most." That night, Margaret passed peacefully in her sleep, surrounded by the many people whose lives she had touched. The wind howled mournfully across the desert, but it also carried something else, a sense of completion, of a sacred duty faithfully performed. Dancing Moon took over the healing school, and under her guidance, it grew into a legend throughout the West. The pendant passed from teacher to student, each generation adding their own wisdom to the ancient knowledge. The school's influence spread far beyond the desert. Students traveled back to their home territories, establishing healing centers in mining camps, cattle ranches, and frontier settlements. Each center followed the same principles Margaret had learned in the desert. Serve all people equally, listen to the spirit voices, and remember that healing encompasses both body and soul. One of Dancing Moon's most gifted students was a former Confederate soldier named Thomas Reed. He had arrived at the school broken by the memories of war, his hands shaking too violently to hold a rifle, but somehow steady enough to tend wounds. Under Dancing Moon's guidance, he learned to channel his trauma into compassion. Thomas established a healing center in the rough mining town of Devil's Canyon, where violence was as common as dust storms. The miners initially viewed him with suspicion, But when a cholera outbreak struck the town, Thomas's combination of medical knowledge and spiritual healing saved dozens of lives. Word of the healing centers reached the ears of territorial governors and even officials in Washington. Some viewed the movement with suspicion, concerned about the mixing of cultures and the unconventional healing methods. Others saw the practical benefits of having trained healers in remote areas where doctors were scarce. In 1885, a government inspector named Colonel Harrison arrived at Dancing Moon School with orders to investigate reports of Indian magic and unsanctioned medical practices. He was a stern man who believed in order and regulation, and he came prepared to shut down the school. But when Colonel Harrison witnessed Dancing Moon treat a little girl who had been mauled by a mountain lion, something changed in his rigid worldview. The child's injuries were so severe that conventional medicine would have left her disfigured at best. Yet under Dancing Moon's care, guided by the wind voices and the ancient wisdom, the girl healed completely. The colonel stayed for 3 weeks, observing the school's operations and interviewing students and patients. He saw former enemies working side by side, cultures blending in harmony, and healing that defied medical explanation. When he returned to Washington, his report praised the school as a model for peaceful coexistence. Meanwhile, the legacy of Windwalker's teachings continued to spread through unexpected channels. Railroad workers carried stories of the desert healers to distant cities. Cattle drovers told tales around campfires of mysterious voices that guided lost travelers to safety. Even hardened outlaws spoke in hushed tones of encounters with healing spirits in the Badlands. One such outlaw was Black Pete Murphy, a gunslinger wanted in 3 territories for bank robbery and murder. He had been shot during a failed heist and was dying slowly from infection when he stumbled into Dancing Moon's school. Most people would have turned him away, but Dancing Moon saw beyond his crimes to the wounded soul beneath. As she treated his infected wound, Dancing Moon spoke to him about the voices that had guided him to her door. "The spirits don't judge your past," she said. "They only ask what you will do with your future." Black Pete's transformation was remarkable. As his body healed, so did his spirit. He became one of the school's most dedicated students, using his knowledge of the criminal underworld to help other outlaws find redemption through healing service. The school's influence even reached the halls of power in various territorial capitals. When the daughter of New Mexico's territorial governor fell ill with a mysterious fever that baffled doctors, he secretly sent for Dancing Moon. The young woman's recovery was so complete that the governor became a quiet patron of the healing school. As the years passed, Dancing Moon began to experience the same spiritual visions that had guided Margaret. She saw the web of connections spreading across the West, healing centers linked by invisible threads of compassion and wisdom. The wind voices spoke to her of a greater purpose, a healing that extended beyond individual patients to the very soul of the frontier. One vision showed her a great gathering that would take place in the desert, bringing together healers from all the centers to share knowledge and renew their spiritual bonds. Dancing Moon began planning this gathering, sending word through the network of healers that had grown from Margaret's original school. The first great healing gathering took place in the spring of 1891, at the same desert location where Margaret had first met Windwalker. Over 200 healers attended, representing dozens of different tribes and backgrounds. For 3 days, they shared techniques, told stories, and performed ceremonies that honored both traditional medicine and spiritual healing. During the gathering, something extraordinary happened. As the healers formed a great circle for the closing ceremony, the wind began to blow with unusual intensity. Many participants reported hearing voices speaking in languages they didn't recognize, but somehow understood. The voices spoke of unity, of healing that transcended cultural boundaries, and of a new chapter in the relationship between all peoples of the West. Thomas Reed, now grey-haired and respected throughout the territory, stood to address the gathering. "We are the living bridge that Margaret and Windwalker envisioned," he said. "Through our work, enemies become friends, strangers become family, and the desert itself becomes a place of healing rather than hardship." The gathering became an annual tradition, drawing participants from across the expanding nation. Each year, the circle grew larger and the influence of the healing philosophy spread further. By the time of the last Indian Wars, there were voices of peace and healing on both sides of every conflict. Dancing Moon lived to see the closing of the frontier, but she also saw the opening of new possibilities. The healing centers had evolved into hospitals, schools, and community centers that served people of all backgrounds. The pendant that had once belonged to Margaret continued to pass from teacher to student, each generation carrying forward the ancient wisdom. When Dancing Moon finally passed to the spirit world in 1905, she was surrounded by hundreds of students and colleagues who had been touched by her healing gift. The wind that night carried her voice to every corner of the West, blessing all who had dedicated their lives to serving others. Margaret lived to be 91, still practicing her healing arts until the very end. On the night she died, witnesses claimed the wind howled across the desert with unusual intensity, as if the spirits themselves were welcoming her home. The pendant was never found among her belongings, but children in the area still report hearing whispers on the wind, and occasionally travelers lost in the desert speak of meeting an elderly woman who offers them water and guidance before vanishing into the heat shimmer. Some say that on certain nights, when the wind blows strong across the desert, you can still hear three voices carried on the breeze: Windwalker's ancient wisdom, Margaret's compassionate healing, and Dancing Moon's bridging of worlds, all working together to guide lost souls toward their true purpose. What do you think happened to Windwalker after he helped Margaret find her way? Share your theories in the comments below and let us know what you believe about the mysterious voices that guided them both through the desert wind.